Alrighty then, my name is Graham and I run a Discord server called RPG Nook. We play Call of Cthulhu and a few other role-playing systems every week, playing anywhere between 1 and 3 games over the course of the week. Some people have expressed interest in how I run my games on Roll20, how I set them up, and how I pick my scenarios. So I thought I'd do a little breakdown video of what is one of the most classic Call of Cthulhu games, The Haunting. So The Haunting is a classic scenario that stood the test of time, and it's beloved by most of the Call of Cthulhu fanbase, I think, as the premier where to start when running the system. And it does this because it is very well structured and hits all the right beats, for me at least, on what I'm looking for when running a scenario. So the first thing I look for when I pick up a RPG is the premise. Is it compelling enough for me to run it? And is it simple enough for me to create a good hook that the players that read it will want to play it as well without giving away too much of the plot? And this is where The Haunting steps in and does it so well, with an iconic known story of a haunted house and the fact you need to investigate it and find out why it's haunted. This takes you on a very simple 3-act structure where you take on the initial investigation, unravel the mystery, and find the clues of how to confront Corbett, and the final confrontation against Corbett himself in the basement. However, the acts are flexible, and they really need to be. This is king when it comes to RPGs, where you will get the RPer who will turn over every rock and look under every leaf to string the story together and find the nuggets of information that will really help them in the final confrontation. You will get the odd filthy D&Der or highly combative player who will run straight to the final location and try and beat down the big bad with whatever they have to hand. Both are accommodated here, and rightly so. The players can go to the Corbett house, they can find all the haunts and look in most of the locations and even find Corbett himself and have a slim chance to beat him. You can, however, kick them straight back out with a few tricks in the haunts to put them back to Act 1 to start the initial investigation as well, taking them down that road too if you wish. The second thing I look for in a scenario is a timeline. This is very useful for keeping the story straight in your head and plotting out, referencing all the events and beats of the game. However, there's usually not one, so it's not at the end of the world. However, it can be a bit of a pain in the arse not to have one when players come up with questions that you should be able to answer within a few seconds, but end up having to dig through manuals to find. And with that, the players will have to be able to follow it as well. Whether they piece the timeline together with handouts or general information, it needs to be solid enough to make sense with a few holes still in it for the players to make assumptions and guesses at what's going on. Now, the Haunting does fall down here as it doesn't have one. However, it is a free scenario and limited space in the actual PDF itself is probably constraining it as well. So it's not a huge problem to put one together yourself. It's just a bit of time. After this, I always look for the scenario settings and locations. Is the setting compelling enough for me to play through it at least once? And usually I play scenarios more than once, so I have to be quite engaged with the location to actually pick it up and put effort into it. And more importantly, will the players be drawn into the world and the era and pulled through it naturally to each location? Now, The Haunting does this, setting up in 1920s Boston, a fairly classic place for Call of Cthulhu to be set. And it has multiple locations throughout the city to go to. It's almost sandbox in design, revolving minor scenes around one major scene, which will be the Corbett House even. And these locations aren't the only locations they can visit. They can also decide to go to something like a gun shop or really take you off the reservation when it comes to what they want to look at. And a wide and deep setting like Boston really gives you enough juice to take that and run with it if they wish to do something off the books. Now, The Haunting does fall down here in some regards. They don't provide any descriptives for any locations other than the Corbett House that I know of or remember. This is done, I think, on purpose because the scenario itself is designed for new keepers. And with that in mind, it wants you to be able to come up with descriptions yourself and encourage new keepers to do so. I think there's even a paragraph that explicitly says it doesn't give any descriptors, and I think that's why. Now, going on to what the scenes are, most of them are excellent small scenes which are compelling enough to take the players and pull them in to get the handouts. They're very classic, like the library, the Hall of Records, the Boston Globe. However, there is one in particular I dislike, and that is the neighbourhood the Corbett House is set in. It's not your idyllic street with the haunted house at the end, the sort of shunned property. It's a built-up area that's been commercialized, and there's a character called Mr. Dooley in it, and he is very forced in my opinion. So when I run this scenario, I do change the neighborhood back to what I think is more of a classic style of street where the haunted house is the standout. Now, on top of all this, there's the finale and its solutions. Is the scenario itself satisfying to end? Will the players have a great final moment where they triumph or fail in front of the mythos? The Haunting does provide an excellent finale with Mr. Corbett. It is deadly, the tension's quite high, the house is very well laid out, and it does grab them and hold them. There's not a lot of ways out once they get into the basement and that confrontation starts. However, it doesn't really give you too many alternative solutions, which is a great pity. There is the book you can find at the Chapel of Contemplation. It does give you information and possibilities there to perhaps summon something, and there is Corbett's journals as well. The Dimensional Shambler, for example, can be a spell found in there, but it will take some time to learn, and if you're not using spontaneous Cthulhu use, which is an optional role, it's not hugely useful on the fly. However, I have had completely killed the party with the attempt of summoning creatures more than once. The other interesting solution which I came across once was the players decided to convince the landlord to level the house and sell the land. This was an earlier version of the game I played where the neighborhood was still the commercial one that is described in the scenario itself, and they convinced them that the land was way more valuable to be sold off than renting the house for X amount of years. And it makes way more sense for the landlord just to do this and convince them to essentially seal Corbett in the basement forever, for better or worse, which was amusing out of the box thinking and pretty fun to play. But as I said, I've got problems with the neighborhood itself, so that solution dried up a little bit. So the next thing I look at is handouts. Handouts are brilliant. People love handouts. Players love getting them, and keepers can become slightly obsessed with creating them, including myself. I do like the odd handouts. So the scenario itself needs to provide at least a good amount of detailed information for me to create handouts or have handouts already created for it. In front of you now you can see this is the basic opening screen for the haunting. In fact, it's what the players will look at for almost all of the haunting that they'd play with me on Roll20. It's visually impactful for the player. They have all the information they need for them in front of them. The era, the house, where the setting is, and even the opening handout that I give out for my groups that leads them into the scenario. It's always there in front of them, so they can refer to it. So yeah, handouts are very important to players to be visually stimulated in continuing the story. And you can look online and find the handouts for a lot of the classic scenarios like the haunting. There's plenty of them online, and in the link description below I'll link a package with everything I use in a neat little folder for you to play this game as I play it if you wish. But if you can't find them online and you're capable of the basics of Photoshop or GIMP, for example, basic art packages, you can create these things yourself as long as the scenario has enough depth and information to do so. So I always look for the opportunity to make handouts, or at least have them if the scenario provides them. They're always useful to keep the player engaged and have them entertained, shall we say. Now, there's also things like major scenes. Major scenes always need some sort of layout, and the atmosphere and tension is important here. So good scenario maps and good location visuals are always something to keep in mind. The haunting, being a very old scenario, has lots of stuff out there that is fan made. This map in particular is quite famous for being pretty good. I can't remember the creator's name, but it will be in the package below. So that brings us to NPCs. NPCs are the lifeblood of any scenario. They breathe a slice of life into the setting as the players move around and interact with the locations. They have to make sense and they have to be interesting. If they're not, the players will just be faced with cookie cutter characters that they are only there for one thing, and it's a fairly boring process for them to interact with these NPCs. So motives and depth is quite important when you're looking at NPCs in the actual scenario themselves. The haunting is a mixed bag when it comes to this. Where it is quite a short scenario, and the locations other than the Corbett house are minor scenes, the characters within them are minor too, and there's only a small amount of them. They're enough to get by, and it's okay, but there is no depth to them. But when it comes to Corbett himself, he's well fleshed out, his motives are there, there's even an image of him which helps, and he is a fairly iconic bad guy. On top of that, there are no pre-gens for the haunting. Again, this comes down to the haunting being a quick guide game designed for players to design their own characters. However, pre-gens are always useful if you wish to pick up and play within a certain time. I think that's a bit of an oversight, but again, space, and it is free. So these are the core pillars of what makes a good scenario for me. These elements will never be perfect. No scenario is perfect, but any issues you find will cost you time to correct, and it depends on how much time you wish to invest in fixing mistakes that you feel shouldn't be there in the first place, or you can move on to something which is more complete. That said, you can spend 12 minutes making a timeline flicking through a manual, or you can spend 3 days creating an elaborate handout which may never be found. It's up to you how you wish to approach it, and the author's style and your needs will often clash, as not everyone thinks the same. So I hope that was an interesting breakdown for you of how I pick scenarios, at least, and the package for Roll20 of my version of The Haunting can be found below. Thanks for watching.